Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today at the Center for International Security and Cooperation at Stanford University, at least virtually. Welcome to our weekly research seminar. My name is Harold Trinkunas. I'm the interim social science co-director for CSAC, and I'll be chairing today's session with Dr. Jill Hazelton. Dr. Hazelton is a professor at the U.S. Naval War College and a visiting scholar at CSAC this year. She is joining us today to speak about her new book with Cornell University Press, just out in the last month. There's, in fact, in the announcement for the event, I believe there's a discount code for the book if you wish to order a copy. The book is Bullets Not Ballots, based on our research on, I believe, 5 different cases of counterinsurgency, looking at re-examining the conventional wisdom that hearts and minds approaches are necessary for successful counterinsurgency. In fact, Professor Hazelton is going to, I believe, challenge that to some extent today, and we very much look forward to hearing about her work. Before I turn it over to her to discuss her research, this is being run in a webinar format, so if you have a question at any point in time during the seminar, you can enter the question in the Q&A function on Zoom, and I will be moderating the Q&A at the end of Professor Hazelton's discussion. Professor Hazelton, over to you.
Thank you, Harold. Thank you so much for the invitation. I am glad to be here, even if I'm not in sunny California. The overview, so you know where we're going. I don't want to keep you in suspense and just tell you at the end. I'm going to challenge the conventional wisdom about the belief that good governance reforms democratize and protect civilians, that these measures are what leads to counterinsurgency success. In fact, what I find is that counterinsurgency success is very ugly. It does not involve reforms or popular support. It does require deals with sometimes quite unappealing actors, and it does require brute force control of civilians. The plan for this talk, the next 30 minutes or so, I'll explain the topic and why it matters. I'll discuss the conventional wisdom at a little more length on what I think is wrong with it. I'll give you my argument, and I look forward to the Q&A session. So the topic is counterinsurgency. I define insurgency as an armed, organized, persistent political challenger to the government. And success in countering an insurgency is fundamentally that the threatened government remains in power. There's a little more fine-grained definition as well. I use the US government counterinsurgency guide, the definition that they brought forward, which is marginalization of the insurgents to the point at which they are destroyed, co-opted, or reduced to irrelevance. That seems a reasonable bar to try and achieve. And I also consider an insurgency defeated or the counterinsurgent successful if the state goes at least 5 years without conflict recurrence. The larger topic here is military intervention. In policy terms, I'm looking at liberal great power military intervention in internal conflicts that is intended to create a greater political order through the use of organized violence. In theoretical terms, I want to understand how the threat and the use of force may or may not help threatened governments attain their political objectives. So what? Why do we care? Well, first of all, military intervention is not rare. It rarely reaches the occupation level of wars like Vietnam or the current conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan, but liberal great powers do not infrequently send military aid of various types to counterinsurgent governments in order to protect their smaller partner. It also matters because when the great power intervener expects the counterinsurgent to make reforms and keeps continuing its support, in expectation that sooner or later, the government will realize what's in its best interest. What that does is raise the moral, the humanitarian, and the other costs of the conflict within the state, within the region, and sometimes even globally. Finally, in policy terms, what this means is that liberal interveners must weigh the limited gains of keeping a partner in power against the costs of supporting greater repression. The conventional wisdom is what I call the good governance approach because of its focus on the relationship between the people and the state. You might have heard it referred to as population-centric counterinsurgency or the hearts and minds approach to counterinsurgency. Basically, they're all in the same basket of understanding about how to defeat insurgencies. So fundamentally, the argument for the good governance approach is that success is a process of building a centralized, modern, liberal democratic state that provides political, economic, and social reforms, as well as public goods. And this in turn gains popular support for the government and weakens the insurgency. That reforms are things that structural political changes that affect, hopefully positively, everyone in the state. So greater political participation, increased respect for human and civil rights, professionalized military, these reduce corruption. These are the kinds of things that fit into the bundle that's called reforms. From the military end, the understanding of what succeeds in counterinsurgency has been pretty similar throughout the many interventions since the end of World War II, including the anti-colonial wars of that period. A RAND study from 1962, which included a large number of participants in those wars, identifies the path to success as identifying and redressing the political, economic, military, and other issues fueling the insurgency. Gain control over and protect the population, which is the prime center of gravity. So identifying and redressing these grievances is a very high bar. That's a real challenge. More recently, we see a similar expectation about what succeeds in counterinsurgency. This is from the introduction to the US Army Marine Corps Counterinsurgency Field Manual of 2006. General Petraeus and General Amos write that soldiers and Marines are expected to be nation builders as well as warriors. They must be prepared to help establish institutions and basic services. They must be able to facilitate establishing local governance and the rule of law. But once again, this is a very, very high bar. No matter how good your military is, this is fundamentally not what militaries are designed to do. To continue this look at the military conventional wisdom on counterinsurgency, the Counterinsurgency Field Manual defines it as armed social work. It advises that the military should only attack insurgents when they get in the way. General Petraeus warned his troops in Afghanistan, if we kill civilians or damage their property, we will create more enemies. And General Kureli, based on his experience in Iraq, argues that a gun on every street corner, though visually appealing, provides only a short-term solution. It does not equate to long-term security grounded in a democratic process. So once more, you see how high this bar is. The creation and continued existence of a democratic process within the counterinsurgent state. In the policy world, the conventional wisdom is very similar. Nadia Shadlow, who is a think tanker and was the lead author on the 2017 National Security Strategy, argues in her 2017 book that the US military must continue to fill ungoverned spaces with governance operations. That's political and military activities by military forces to establish and institutionalize a desired political order during and after combat. Again, this is a tall order. but it sounds appealing. And then in another example, there's an important book that came out in 2018, Small Wars, Big Data, The Information Revolution in Modern Conflict by Ellie Berman, Joseph Felter, and Jacob Shapiro. It argues that the author's goal is to enable Western states to continue extended military interventions when the local ally lacks the capacity or the will to extend governance over hostile territory, and when public support in the intervening state is low. So this is a recipe for how to keep going in the hope of ultimately finding a solution. And it's an interesting example of how a lot of the contemporary work on counterinsurgency doesn't ask the question, what succeeds? Researchers cut into that question in smaller ways. They'll look at, for example, how aid distribution in a particular area for a particular time affects views of the government or views of the intervener, things like this. So they take a more manageable slice, cut into the problem, you might say. The conventional wisdom includes both a number of practitioners from the post-World War II period, Julian Paget, Robert Thompson, David Galula, and more recent authors in the academy like Paul Miller, Ellie Berman and Isla Matinok, Anna Getmansky, and Jason Lyall. And this is an indication of just how frequently this belief in counterinsurgency success as a process of instituting good governance comes back again and again. It was popular during the Vietnam period. Sir Robert Thompson, who served in Malaya, argued strongly that the Americans should try the good governance approach in Vietnam, for example. And it appeared again in about 2006 when things began going very, very badly for the United States in Iraq. So we see this idea come back, and there are good reasons for that. It's normatively appealing, and within its own universe, it makes perfect sense. It's logical. There are some problems though. There are a number of assumptions that I think are at least problematic. Counterinsurgent governments, for example, are assumed to deliver what they promise. If they say they'll make reforms, it's assumed that they do. Another assumption is that government actions produce the expected positive effects on the populace and negative effects on the insurgency without necessarily tracing the process and looking at what actually happens. There's the assumption that counterinsurgent governments have the capability and the will to institute democratizing reforms, and that the military is willing and able to both avoid unnecessary civilian casualties and respect human rights. There's the assumption that the populace wants democratizing reforms and that it has no regional, ethnic, class, religious, nationalist, or economic interests that might run counter to the institution of good governance. There's the belief also that the majority of the populace has no political preferences and will support the stronger side. And yes, that does contradict the previous assumption. There are a number of internal contradictions in writing on the good governance approach. There is the assumption, and this is a big one, that the intervener can decisively shape events. There's a belief that modernization resolves internal conflict. And there's a belief that democracies are more redistributive and less corrupt than authoritarian states. There is revisionist work on counterinsurgency. One of the most important examples comes from 1988. That's Michael Schaefer's Deadly Paradigms. There's a set of historians in Britain who have also been doing important work. Hugh Bennett, Paul Dixon, Carl Hack, and David French among them. So I am not de novo on this. There is a significant amount of important research that doesn't necessarily trickle through to good governance proponents. The theoretical background that I am bringing to this project First, the counterinsurgency is primarily a domestic political process of violent state building. And the state building process has historically been convulsive. The political order arises from elite efforts to prevail in violent political rivalry, that elites rule to protect their own interests, and reforms mean regime suicide. And finally, that once elites have determined through violent competition which of them will dominate, then political stability will follow as long as that elite bargain holds. My theory, the compellence theory, argues that a certain process takes place over the course of the insurgency. First of all, the counterinsurgent uses compellence to destroy the insurgency as a fighting force and as an organization through the threat, display, and application of force that breaks its will and its ability to fight on. There are two paths that run in tandem on this. The first is the accommodation of rival elites. The government offers rewards to gain the cooperation of political and military leaders in exchange for information on the insurgency and the populace and the provision of military capabilities. So fundamentally, this is payoffs or co-optation to increase your political knowledge and your military power. At the same time, the government uses its enhanced capabilities to conduct a military campaign directly against the insurgency that destroys the insurgency's capability and will, and conducts an indirect military effort using brute force, the power to take and to hold, to block the flow of resources to insurgents. And most commonly, this is done through tight military control of civilians. It's not a very palatable choice. There are four important differences between my theory and the good governance approach. First of all, I analyze the process of countering an insurgency as one of violent state building rather than political competition for popular allegiance. I identify the achievable outcome as long-term political stability rather than liberal democracy. I focus on the domestic interests of the counterinsurgent government and other elites rather than on the efforts of the intervening great power. And I identify useful as well as costly counterinsurgent uses of force, which again is a less palatable part of my explanation of counterinsurgency success. I designed the project for external validity. I picked the hardest cases I could for my theory. The research question is, under what conditions do counterinsurgent governments succeed? The scope is post-1945 campaigns targeting insurgents who survive on civilian support, and cases with and without an ethnic component. So this does not apply to the kind of insurgencies that Jeremy Weinstein looks at when the insurgency is primarily supported by material resources, timber, gems, and so on. The domain of the project is the 5 most often cited successful campaigns that are most often touted as models for Western states to follow. These are least likely for my theory to explain. And I add one additional case that is often cited as particularly vicious in order to see how that success is reached compared to the successes in the cases presented as models. I use comparative historical case studies of what governments did and what came of it, rather than what the intervener demanded and the governments promised. I use process tracing to determine the actions and reactions leading to success. And I focused on contemporaneous documents of US British archives, memoirs, oral histories, secondary literatures beyond the coin literature, and interviews with participants when I could. I had a set of 6 questions in the comparative case studies. I wanted to know, when did the counterinsurgent marginalize the insurgents to the point of irrelevance? When did the counterinsurgent succeed? How did it do so? Were there reforms? If there were, to what extent were they implemented, and when did they occur relative to the counterinsurgent success? I wanted to know if there were accommodations, and if so, when they occurred relative to counterinsurgent success. I wanted to know whether there was an increase in popular support for the government, and if so, when it occurred relative to the defeat of the insurgent threat, and any reforms or accommodations that were implemented. And finally, I wanted to know if the strength of the insurgency varied with any of the key elements in my theory. The cases, the first 5 are the ones that are usually presented as models for the United States and Western partners going forward. There's the British campaign in Malaya, the Malayan Emergency from 1948 to 1957. There's the Greek Civil War, in which the US backed successive governments from 1947 to 1949. There is the US backed Philippine War on the Huk in the Philippines, 1946 to 1954. There's the British-led campaign in Dhofar from 1965 to 1976. This one gets less publicity, but I think it's one of the most interesting. There's the Salvadoran Civil War, in which the US backed successive governments from 1979 to 1992. And then finally, to identify whether my theory is generalizable or not, I looked at the Turkey PKK war, which was US supported in terms of intelligence and in other ways as well, from 1984 to 1999, with the capture of the PKK leader, Abdullah Öcalan. I have a set of predictions for the good governance approach and for the compellence theory, and they're very different. In the good governance approach, if that is what leads to success in counterinsurgency, I expect to see intervener aid that leads to government reforms meeting popular demands and needs, which in turn increases support for the government, weakens support for the insurgency, and is accompanied by a military campaign directly against the insurgents to break their capability to fight. The compellence theory has a rather different set of predictions. The process here includes the accommodation of rival elites for information, cooperation, and military power, the use of brute force to control civilians in order to cut the flow of resources to the insurgents, and the use of the additional assets, material and non-material, that it's gained through accommodation to attack the insurgency directly to break its capability and its will to fight. I have ways in which I have identified whether I'm wrong or not. So this is about falsifiability. If reforms take place before the government defeats the insurgent threat militarily, my theory has limited explanatory power. If popular support for the government rises before the government defeats the threat militarily, my theory has limited explanatory power. And if elite accommodation occurs only after the government defeats the insurgent threat militarily, then my theory has limited explanatory power. 3 more points to underline the possibility of whether or not I'm wrong. The compellence theory cannot explain counterinsurgency success if any of these conditions apply in these cases. If the government does not control the populace, which I identify as necessary for success, and the conventional wisdom identifies as counterproductive, my theory doesn't hold. If the government implements reforms benefiting all, gaining popular support while reducing it for the insurgency, and then defeats the insurgent threat, my theory doesn't hold, because I challenge the conventional wisdom that reforms and popular support are necessary for success. And finally, if the government systematically avoids harm to civilians, even at military cost, I'm wrong, because I challenge the conventional wisdom in arguing that the use of force against civilians is necessary for success, and uses of force may, unfortunately, involve harm. So the key actors I'm looking at in this project are the government and other elites of the counterinsurgent state. That includes political entrepreneurs and entrepreneurs of violence, including insurgents who may switch sides or who may inform on their comrades, Um, and the thing about elites is they want to keep what they have. That's why they're fighting in the first place. They want to keep their wealth and they want to keep their power. Rival elites, meanwhile, want to gain sufficient wealth and power to stop fighting and enjoy their newly acquired wealth and power. And this also is logical. Now, the thing about elites and their role in this process is that elites mediate relationships between popular, formal, and informal groups in the government. And the elites shape government, insurgent, and civilian choices. So it's the elites who are key in this process in the compellence theory, not the populace. What I find is that counterinsurgency success has three requirements. It requires relatively low cost accommodations of domestic rivals. It requires the use of brute force to reduce the flow of resources to the insurgency, including through military control of civilian behavior, and includes a direct use of force to break the insurgency's will and capability to fight. This is a phased process in which the government builds its strength, and as it does so, exerts its increased capabilities to directly and indirectly weaken the insurgency and reduce its threat. I'll look quickly at the Malayan Emergency because this is probably the most familiar, most famous counterinsurgency success. This was a British effort in its colony of Malaya to defeat a communist nationalist insurgency between 1948 and 1957. There are predictions for the good governance approach here and predictions for what the compellence theory should show. The good governance approach predicts that we should see intervener aid. We do. We see Britain supporting its colonial government in Malaya. We should see reforms meeting popular demands. We don't. We should see increasing support for the government. We don't. We should see weakening support for the insurgency. We don't see that either. We do see direct attacks on the insurgency to break its capability to fight. And my rival theory, we should see accommodation of rival elites for information, cooperation, and military power, and we do. We should see the use of brute force to control civilians, to cut the flow of resources to the insurgents, and we do. And we should see the government using its increased capabilities to attack insurgents directly, to break their capability and their will to fight, and we do see that. The conventional story, the usual story, the familiar story about Malaya is that the British initially failed to defeat the insurgency because they used indiscriminate force, collective punishment, forced deportation, imprisonment without trial, and other harsh military treatment of civilians. But the British learned to seek popular support through reforms and the careful use of force to avoid damage to civilian interests. And as Robert Comer, who was the pacification guru in Vietnam, explained in one of his works, the government undertook a variety of political, economic, and social measures accompanied by an information campaign to win hearts and minds, along with the move towards independence. And typically, insurgent defeat is dated to 1954, although the emergency continued until Malaysian independence in 1957. So I want to say, if you find the story I tell about Malaya different from what your understanding is of the case, that's exactly the point. I focus on the government and what it did and what came of it, rather than on what was promised and what was demanded. So my 6 questions for cases. When was a counterinsurgency successful? The insurgency, I find, was broken as a threat by 1948. The Malayan National Liberation Front was rendered unable to achieve its objectives that year and never regained its strength. And we can see in contemporaneous British documents that the British recognized this. In 1948, the government deemed a coordinated offensive unlikely because the group couldn't communicate. The same year, the government in Malaya said it's evident that the initiative has largely passed to the security forces and the bandits, that's the insurgents, are in considerable difficulties. The year later, the government tells us that militarily the bandits are already beaten because they cannot hope to succeed in their objects. By 1951, withdrawing to the jungle, the insurgents could no longer mass force, communicate, or plan. They're done. In 1955, the present level of the emergency was such that the life of the country proceeds without significant interference. Second question, how did the government succeed? It cut insurgents off from resources. The British began driving residents into prison camps in 1948. Brute force control continued throughout the campaign. By 1952, more than 500,000 people had been rounded up and forced into new villages and other prison camps. The government targeted the insurgency directly with large military sweeps through insurgent areas and eventually jungle operations against the surviving bands, which included the use of artillery and air power. The use of collective punishment. In 1952, I shouldn't laugh because this is a very sad anecdote. The High Commissioner, Sir Gerald Templar, berated residents of a new village about the need to provide information on the insurgency. He punished them by imposing further controls on their movements and further rationing of food and other necessities. Villagers listened in silence, according to a contemporaneous newspaper account, simmering at their unjust punishment. In 1955, the British government in Malaya considered food denial, that is, limiting the amounts of food available to residents of Malaya, is still the most effective weapon we employ. In 1957, the year the emergency ended, the director of operations said that rationing of food for civilians in prison camps remained the basis of operations, and he expected it to remain so after independence. Were there reforms? Plans for independence, first of all, were not a response to the insurgency, but preceded it. They dated back to 1942 and were well known at the time in the region. Beginning in 1946, the British chose to balance communal interests in government rather than what they had wanted to do, which was doing away with communal interest by creating a pluralistic democracy. The same year, the British abandoned their plans for equal citizenship for all ethnicities and residents. They had to do this because the traditional Malay sultans insisted the sultans were determined to remain the dominant political class. And finally, basic services were provided in only scattered ways and at scattered times in the new villages, starting in 1952, and mostly not handled by the government, but by charities, missionaries, and the Malaysian Chinese Association. So the government was not helping the people in these prison camps. How about accommodations? There were accommodations, and they began at the same time that the insurgency was defeated. Communal leaders, including the Malay sultans and ethnic Chinese and ethnic Indian business leaders, received a variety of accommodations from the British. The British sponsored or supported communal organizations of local elites. Some of these organizations ultimately turned into political parties. The British brought members of the different communities into the government. The elites shared information, they channeled popular concerns upward, and they gave the imprimatur of local support to the government. What they gained in return included local status and the status of having British support at a time when there was little anti-British feeling. They gained a share in governmental and informal power without political violence and at low risk. They gained authority, they gained support from the British for their organizations, and they gained a voice for their communities. Was there an increase in popular support? No, and the British moaned about this all the time. In 1951, the efforts of government have been directed towards encouraging a spirit of Malayan nationalism, but so far with little success. In 1954, the populace was still largely apathetic. The public has, as usual, done its best to disprove Aristotle's dictum that man is by nature a political animal. State Department doesn't write memos like that. Why not? In 1955, despite British efforts, the majority of the people have so far been brought only to a state of reasonably friendly apathy. As late as 1956, well after the defeat of the insurgent threat, local leaders remained uninterested. And finally, does the strength of the insurgency vary with any of the key elements in my theory? Yes. Yes, it does. We see insurgent strength declining from 1948 with the use of direct military force and increasing control of civilians to cut the flow of resources to insurgents. And both of these are enabled by accommodation of rival elites. The treatment of civilians, as I mentioned, is quite distasteful in these cases. In Malaya, resettlement meant physical removal of squatters to areas where they can be controlled. And that meant armed camps surrounded by barbed wire. FAR-ELF, which is one of my favorite acronyms, wrote in 1951 that the populace in these prison camps did not properly appreciate that they were immeasurably better off. So they were ungrateful as well as without resources and enduring tight military control in these camps. Finally, as another example, Dr. Han Soo-yin described in 1952 seeing civilians huddled in a resettlement community. I shall never forget their pale and puffy faces, berry, or the ulcers on their legs. Their skin was the hue of the swamp. They stank. There was no clean water. Similarly, uses of force in other ways continued throughout the campaign. The British deported more than 30,000 residents. At one point, General Briggs argued that if he could ship all the detainees off to China and dump them there, it would have a great effect on the situation in Malaya. Apparently, that wasn't politically possible. In 1950, British authorities in Malaya recognized that we are doing little to improve the lot of the masses beyond increasing taxation. In 1952, there were vast medical and health problems to be dealt with. In 1955, ethnic Chinese in Penang State considered the new villages small and remote concentration camps devoid of any attraction whatsoever. And by 1957, the end of the emergency, there was still considerable discontent in the new villages. So the policy implications that flow from these findings cascade into my final policy recommendation. First of all, corrupt, repressive governments exist because they serve the interests of those in power. Second, governments resist reforms that will reduce their power and wealth. Third, interveners are unlikely to help democratize counterinsurgent governments. And what that means is don't intervene militarily, great powers, hoping that reforms will defeat insurgents, because the costs likely exceed any benefits to anyone, except perhaps elites within the counterinsurgent state. My takeaways here, counterinsurgency success is ugly. It sometimes involves making deals with unappealing actors. It involves brute force control of civilians. It does not involve good governance reforms or popular support. Intervening in hope that reforms will defeat the insurgency raises moral, humanitarian, and other costs locally and regionally, if not globally. And finally, intervening means empowering further repression. So I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Professor Hazelton. And we have, I think, about 20 minutes for Q&A. As a reminder, everyone, please go ahead and enter any questions you might have in the Q&A function in Zoom. You'll see that in the bottom edge of your screen, and I'll go ahead and read those out at the appropriate time. I encourage our CSAC pre- and postdoctoral fellows especially to enter questions. We usually let them go first. But maybe I could lead things off by asking a clarifying question. I noticed that in the two prescriptions you laid out for the good governance model and the compellence model, they both include targeting the counterinsurgents. And it seemed to me that the wording for the good governance one was targeting their capabilities, and in the compellence model, it was capabilities and will to resist. And first of all, I want to make sure I read that correctly or heard that correctly. And second of all, could you clarify what the distinction is? Because it seems to me that most or some theories of military operations, applications of military force, always consider breaking the enemy combatant's will to resist as an objective of the use of force in combat. And so what would the distinction actually be between the two models when it comes to the issue of will to fight among the insurgents?
The counterinsurgency literature that supports and advances the good governance approach focuses on the need to destroy the capability of the insurgents. I have not seen the references to breaking their will to fight on that I found in the archival material and in first-person accounts and so on. It was striking to me in all of the cases. Yeah, stronger in some than in others, but there's variation on all of these points across the cases. There was no question that counterinsurgents understood that they wanted to destroy not only capabilities, but the will to fight. You can have, you might have an insurgency that loses its capability, but still tries to fight on in a variety of ways that are a higher level of political violence than the US Counterinsurgency Guide counts as success. So breaking the will of the insurgency turns out to be an important element of what happens and what some governments in fact try to do when they're fighting and defeating insurgencies. So for example, we see surrenders rise, we see insurgents slipping back into their old lives, this kind of thing where the lack of the will to fight on indirectly breaks the insurgent's capability in a different way than, for example, an attack on a band of MNLA in the jungle. Does that make sense?
Thanks. In the interest of time, I'm going to keep going. Although I'll probably have a follow-up question if there's time at the end. But let me go to one of our fellows next. Austin Cooper asks, could you talk more about how and why the good governance consensus crystallized? Perhaps ideology, diplomacy, culture, networks, institutions, e.g. development theory, Cold War liberalism, rise of defense intellectuals, etc. Probably left out some of the most salient factors, but I think Austin, who's one of our predoctoral fellows and a historian, would like you to talk a little bit more about the history of that idea of good governance as a prescription for insurgency.
Austin, thank you. Yeah, all of the elements you mentioned, I think, are in there. And there are a couple of other things. One is that this is a normative approach. This is how counterinsurgency should work. And even from practitioners who know perfectly well, like Galula, that they were not helping and supporting and protecting the people. That's not the story they told. I cannot get inside the mind of Galula or Paget or Thompson, but I think the practitioners advance the good governance approach because they want to feel okay about what they've achieved. That may be wacky, but that is one way I think of understanding it. There's another element, at least why this approach has held such a grip on the imagination of Americans. And that has to do with the good governance story is basically a replication of the US ideal of democracy, of what it looks like. Now, the fact is that democracy is never perfect, and the legitimate control of violence throughout one's territory is not ever perfect and so on. But the fact that this is what states are supposed to do, they're supposed to protect and serve their people, is so appealing. And the problem is that when you look around, you see that it's not all that common for states to be interested in supporting their people.
Thanks. And I think in a related question, FSI Senior Fellow Martha Crenshaw asks, thank you, but why has the hearts and mind theory been so persuasive for so long? So we can understand why it crystallized in the Cold War, but why has it persisted for so long? Similarly, no, let's go to that.
Okay, this is also a great question. It is related. And I think the most important thing to understand is that there's tremendous belief in and support for the good governance model, but it's not actually what Western liberal states do on the ground. We can see in Iraq, for example, things like the tight military control of the city of Mosul under General Petraeus. Residents could only go in and out on buses and so on. It's very similar to the new villages in Malaya, but that was never a newspaper story, right? So the fundamental point is that there's a difference between belief or normative ideal on the one hand and execution on the other. And that's why we don't see reforms in these cases. The counterinsurgent governments are simply unwilling to do what their great power intervener wants them to do. And the counterinsurgent government has the leverage.
So let me go to another question that I think addresses your point regarding the co-optation or negotiations with key rival elites. And David Elliott asks about that's an accommodation strategy, but what about using, to what extent is division or rivalries or divide and conquer used as a strategy?
I did not see in any of the contemporaneous documents that I looked at, and I did archival research on all 5 of these cases. Malaya, Greece, the Philippines, Dhofar, and El Salvador. I did not see in any of those cases discussions of or examples of divide and conquer tactics. That doesn't mean that they weren't there. Sometimes I was looking at very tactical daily SITREP reports. Sometimes I was looking at strategic level, top of the government reports. And sometimes somewhere in between, as with the far off material on Malaya. I think it's possible to, in Dhofar, we see the British-led military suborning certain insurgent leaders to come over to the government side. So that you could think of as a divide and conquer effort. And those defected insurgents did go on to lead FERCAs, militias, on behalf of the government. And they did make an effort to win over family, friends, neighbors, colleagues to the government side. But to me, that seems much more at the co-optation level than the divide and conquer level. I mean, there are tactical stories in the Philippines, for example, about the military, for example, accusing a town mayor of working with them. So he has to then immediately leave town or he's going to be killed by insurgent support or something like that. But again, I'm not sure that that is so much division as co-optation. I'm willing to argue on the definitional basis also, if you like.
Great. So the question from Matthew Hall, which I'm going to try to expand slightly, where he asks about counterinsurgency campaigns by liberal democracies before 1945, so outside the sort of the sample that you look at. And just at a broader level, what sort of led you to draw 1945 as a dividing point? What are the key distinctions, do you think, in the colonial campaigns, particularly since Malaya was essentially a colonial campaign in many ways, in a sense that the intervener in the government is almost the same, if not identical. So maybe you could speak to that distinction of why you're drawing the line in 1945, and is the issue you're trying to exclude the colonial campaigns, or is there something else going on with that post-1945 focus of your book?
I picked 1945 as a starting point for the universe because one of the tenets of the good governance approach, the population-centric approach, hearts and minds and so on, is treatment of the populace. You must treat the populace properly. You must not damage them or their interests. That is integral to the good governance ideal of success. And in 1945 and onward, norms changed regarding the treatment of civilians. And so that seemed to me an appropriate starting point for an investigation into campaigns that were supposed to have included very, very excruciatingly careful treatment of civilians and turn out to not have that at all. There was a third question in there, Harold, and I didn't quite catch it.
Actually, in the interest of time, let's move on. But it was, I think, to try to draw out the distinction between colonial governments and post-colonial governments, when your case of Malaya was sort of an in-between case, because it's a soon to decolonize, yet still colonial government, which might have still been in transition from the previous model, which was not particularly population-centric in the management of colonies, to one which really truly was much more population-centric later. But this actually brings us to another question from Paul Schulte, who asks about the prolonged disparity between the US, UK, NATO approaches to counterinsurgency, which I think have had elements of population-centric doctrines for quite some time, at least officially, if not in practice, as you show, and other approaches. Paul singles out Russian, but other approaches to counterinsurgency. I guess another way of thinking about it, would be, is to what extent is the good governance approach in the end more of a model for public consumption, which relates to another question asked by Alex Williams, whereas in fact both liberal democracies and authoritarian regimes often use successful counterinsurgents in both liberal democracies and authoritarian governments often use fairly similar tactics and strategies to deal with insurgencies.
Yes, short answer is yes. I would not say that anyone supporting the good governance model individually, personally, is trying to deceive anybody. I do think that, generally speaking, the approach is intended for public consumption, yes. One of the interesting things about the compellence theory is that I do think it explains counterinsurgent success in non-Western, non-liberal interventions as well. If you look at Russia and Chechnya, well, first the Soviets and then Russia. The first Chechen War, dismal failure. Russia goes, what is now Russia, goes back in a couple of years later and has what is frankly a fairly astonishing success through the use of direct force against the insurgency and through the co-optation of local elites. Kadyrov, the head of Chechnya, who is a thug and a warlord unquestionably, was co-opted to support the Russian cause. And so far it's worked out quite well from the Russian and the elite perspective. Yeah, so I think the compellence theory actually does apply to more than Western liberal states. And we could talk about Turkey as an example. It's a quasi-democracy. It's not exactly a liberal state, but the Turkey campaign against the PKK looks astonishingly like the campaign in these 5 cases that are supposed to be good governance triumphs.
So, and let me go back to Alec Williams' question, because he's actually asking a second, I think, equally important question, and which is, even if we can show the compellence model is effective, to what extent is it viable in Western liberal democracies, given, especially in the contemporary media environment, to what extent is it viable normatively or ethically? And given that our liberal democracies simply have a more limited menu of potentially counterinsurgent tactics and strategies, and within that more limited menu, good governance is the best available of the choices on the limited menu, so to speak. So I'm adding to and reinterpreting Alec's excellent question.
Okay, first of all, I don't think the good governance approach is the least bad of the options. I think the least bad option is to not intervene in the first place. Perhaps provide diplomatic support, support at the UN, perhaps provide humanitarian support, but intervening militarily in order to help defeat an insurgency. If you think the good governance model is what is going to help you, you're only extending the war, you're only enabling repression. And extending the war does a variety of nasty things. You have more dead, more wounded, you have more negative emotions fueling individual choices, and you have the spread of political violence throughout the region and sometimes even globally. If you want to think about, say, the way Iraq and Afghanistan radicalized a number of Muslims to the jihadi ideology. So I don't think the good governance approach is the least bad option. The least bad option is to not intervene. Is the good governance approach viable? I think it is, because the American public has such a limited interest in foreign affairs. We see it in action in El Salvador, for example. And there was tremendous popular opposition to the US government's support for the successive Salvadoran governments. And yet, the US government, with the Salvadoran military and the civilian figureheads in the government, did succeed in staying in power by using the compellence theory in action. Is it ethical? No, I don't think it is. I think the human costs are too high, which is why my policy advice is don't intervene.
Terrific. I mean, we've got a lot of great questions. We haven't gotten to them all, but I'm afraid we're out of time. So everyone, please join me in thanking Professor Hazelton for sharing her research, which she's published in a new book with Cornell University Press. I linked both her bio and a link to the press where you can acquire the book in the chat. And thanks everyone for joining us, and hopefully we'll see you back next week at our next CSAC research seminar. Thank you, everyone. Goodbye now.
Thank you.